which is right over the border from East Palestine, Ohio. Darlington, Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania were also chemically nuked by the multi-billion-dollar railroad company, Norfolk Southern. But in the media headlines, unfortunately, you did not, get the wider picture of the contamination. So it was East Palestine, Western Pennsylvania, and you will hear shortly from a toxicologist, as many as 8 states and Canada have been affected and, frankly, contaminated by the chemicals that were exploded over this region of the industrial Midwest. What we're going to do here, and again, this is my second time in the area, but we have been here 7 times in the 18 months since the chemical nuking. I don't even want to use the term derailment or that. This is a chemical nuking. That's what happened here. It's not a controlled burn. A railroad company with the basic approval of the federal government nuked chemicals over a very small area. And just in the last few hours, I interviewed residents, and I'm learning truly alarming information about health problems. Meanwhile, the EPA is saying nothing to see here. We're also learning, unfortunately, really troubling issues when it comes to the legal representation for the residents. If you have not heard, there was a $600 million settlement announced in April. Norfolk Southern settling for $600 million. Probably the fastest settlement I've ever heard of in one of these environmental disasters. So right there was a bit of a red flag for me. But the lawyers that are now representing residents in a 20-mile radius do not know how they came up with 20 miles, because this goes way past 20 miles. But they have kind of changed their tune, and I'm going to show you quite a bit. That it seems that the lawyers are trying to go with the Norfolk Southern script of nothing to see here. So you're going to have to bear with us, because we have a bunch of residents. Some of them are from East Palestine. Some of them are from Pennsylvania. All of them have been affected. So we're going to be talking to residents in person, but we're also going to be trying to bring in an expert toxicologist with over 50 years of experience. We're going to try to bring him in remotely. So I'm hoping there's not any tech issues, but we are not, CNN. We don't have the resources of CNN. By the way, it's like 80 degrees in here, so if I'm schwitzing, I apologize. But I want to start, again, I mentioned to you that about this legal settlement and the fact that by September, this could be finalized. So we're pretty close. Residents in both Ohio, East Palestine and Pennsylvania are pretty damn confused, because there hasn't been a lot of communication, and it's not very easy to find out who you contact to decide whether to opt in or opt out of this giant class action lawsuit. But if you don't opt out, you are going to be manually opted in if you live in a 20-mile radius of this derailment. So recently, the lawyers representing the residents, not all the residents, because not every resident has opted in for the $600 million. If you ask me, $600 million is crumbs. That's a fart in the wind for Norfolk Southern. They're a multi-billion-dollar company, and it should be a lot more than $600 million. But the lawyers representing the residents held a Zoom call or conference, and they brought in a expert, as they call him, a doctor, to share his opinion on the possible contamination and potential health effects, like the future chance of cancer for residents, the future chance of health problems. And this is the lawyers representing the plaintiffs brought in this expert. So you would assume they're bringing in an expert who is going to say, yeah, this is a disaster, residents are sick, we don't even know how many chemicals. But the expert they brought in just so happened to have been on the payroll in the past for Exxon, Chevron, Enbridge. I don't want to miss anybody. Dow Chemical. So they brought in a industry expert who previously consulted or worked for Chevron, Dow Chemical, Exxon, and Enbridge. Go Google those companies. So I want to play this clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to play this clip of what, and this was recent, this was like a week ago, of the lawyers that are supposed to be representing these folks are bringing in this expert to basically say everything's fine. Let's play that clip.
All right. Well, thank you, Rick.
Yep.
We'd like to share a quick video from an experienced doctor who has followed the derailment and has generously offered his expertise. He is not involved in the litigation, and this is a completely independent third party.
I'm a medical doctor and a PhD environmental toxicologist. I grew up in Ohio, in Cincinnati. I got my medical degree from the Ohio State University and my PhD from the University of Cincinnati. Most of my career has been spent dealing with industrial chemical poisonings and environmental releases. Based on my best judgment, there will not be any long-term health impact of chemical exposure from the derailment to community members of East Palestine. But as far as people just living in East Palestine or working there or in nearby neighboring communities, we don't expect there to be any long-term health effects associated with chemical exposure resulting from the derailment. The amount of contamination that would be associated with measurable health effects would depend on the individual chemicals and to some extent on the characteristics of the exposure. But I can tell you that the chemical contaminations that have been clearly associated with health effects in communities have been hundreds of times greater than the measured levels that we are now finding in East Palestine. From the derailment, the number of chemicals that have been produced and that may remain in very low levels in the East Palestine area are dwarfed by the amount of other substances that are there that have been put there over years of just normal human activity. Some of the chemicals that were released are known to be associated with cancer. In particular, vinyl chloride, which was the cause of the Venton burn, is known to be a human carcinogen, especially for the liver. The levels that people were exposed to in the community were so small that we don't expect any kinds of cancers or other health effects to have resulted from those. Well, because there were some small levels of chemicals that were evolved, not zero, the risk due to those chemical exposures is not zero either, but it's very small. It's much, much smaller than 1%. And it's so small that...
Did you hear that? Everything's fine in Kansas. That was not, to be clear, like, that was not, to be clear, like, that was not an, to be clear, and smash the like button, share this live stream, this is a disaster zone. Don't let them lie to you. To be clear, that was not an expert for Norfolk Southern, because you would think that's an expert for the railroad company trying to dodge responsibility. That was an expert, and to remind you if you came to this late, this is an expert doctor who has worked for Dow Chemical, Exxon, Chevron, and Enbridge. So clearly he has a long track record of working for titans of environmental justice like Chevron, Exxon, Dow Chemical, and Enbridge. This was an expert that the plaintiffs' attorneys, who just happen to, if this settlement goes through, are going to get, I believe, around 180 million, maybe 200 million. I don't know them. Maybe they're fine people. I have no idea. But it doesn't really make sense just from a 2 + 2 = 4 level why they would be basically presenting experts to claim everything's fine here. Also, you got to look at key phrases. He says, in my best judgment. Well, what data is this expert looking at? He cited that he was looking at the EPA's testing and the Ohio EPA's testing. Well, the EPA, that we have broken many stories, the EPA has acknowledged that their testing equipment is not capable of detecting certain levels of contamination. The EPA originally had Norfolk Southern doing the testing, which has been described to me as you're allowing your rapists to handle the rape kit. So, I don't know, call me a cynical Susie, I have a very hard time understanding why the plaintiffs' lawyers, who just as recently as a few months ago had a completely different tune. They were saying there's a health problem here. Residents are having health issues. There's contamination. Now suddenly they're presenting experts to say everything's fine. And it just so happens, I could be wrong, but from the emails I've seen, this expert, Dr. Chip Carson, the Dow Chemical guy, the Exxon guy, the Chevron guy, he might be a fine guy, but the companies he's worked for are not fine. He kind of came into the picture, from what I know, around the same time this settlement came about. Isn't that interesting? The settlement was announced in April. One more thing, and then we're going to bring on a toxicologist who has quite a different position than this expert. There's a toxicologist. His name is Stephen Petty. He has, let me make sure I have the numbers right. He has been an expert witness in dozens of the top environmental class action lawsuits in the U.S., and he came to East Palestine pretty soon after this happened in February of 2023. He started testing soil, water. He took, I have not spoken with him, but from the reports, he took between 7 and 30 samples per test. He said, oh, you know what? Why am I saying it? Colin, can we play the video? That 3-minute video of showing Stephen Petty and what he said?
In chemical spills testing was here in town today testing. We caught up with him. Petty has been an expert witness in dozens of the top environmental class action lawsuits in the U.S. He says he came to Ohio because he believes independent testing is needed.
The public can handle negative news. They just want the truth. It's not wrong to tell them we don't know yet.
Do you think they're getting the truth here?
I don't think they've done enough. I think that they're being told too many positive things given the uncertainties.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us on this Friday afternoon. I'm Katie Houston. It has been a busy 3 weeks since that fiery and toxic train derailment in East Palestine. And a law firm is now on the ground there right now doing some independent testing on the air, soil, and water. They want to identify any toxins they can help to give some relief to families upended by the train derailment there earlier this month.
New pictures from a law firm going after Norfolk Southern with a class action lawsuit. This is their testing expert sampling soil and water for a suite of chemicals.
The big issue is I think it's premature to say everything's fine.
At each site, taking between 7 and 30 samples.
I'm looking for waters where things deposited in them, right? So I've done ponds, ditches, bird baths, buckets of water, and then we have sampled well and drinking water.
Stephen Petty owns engineering and expert services in Florida and was hired by Simmons Hanley Conroy.
Try to be complete as we can, and And you have to be a little clever to try to figure out where this stuff was and what to analyze for.
He's testing for vinyl chloride and more.
I realized early on that from the literature, one of the byproducts of burning vinyl chloride is dioxins. So I suggested that the firm sample for those.
Attorney Jane Conroy has been meeting with homeowners, renters, and business owners, walking them through how a class action like this works, the types of investigation and evidence collecting they do. She says people are frightened.
The fear for their children, for their loved ones. What are these toxins going to do? We need to get some sunshine on this issue and these and the running of this railroad through East Palestine.
And the independent tester hopes to get in the rail yard next week to get samples from the cars. On the test he's doing this week, he expects them back in 10 days.
I wanted to have you come out so we could hear you a little better. You're down in there doing the samples, and you're with again?
EES Group. On behalf of, I'm working for Simmons Hanley Conroy. The concern that I think I had originally was, when I was first asked to get involved, is they kind of said, well, everything's okay. But they didn't necessarily measure for a lot of the components, or not very much. And it's well known that vinyl chloride can burn, and part of the combustion products are dioxins. It's one of the most toxic materials. It was one of the key ingredients in Agent Orange.
Okay, Agent Orange, you ever heard of that? So the EPA had to be dragged kicking and screaming to test for dioxins here. They didn't want to test for dioxins here. It was only because residents were raising hell to test for dioxins, which, by the way, if you go back to Times Beach, Missouri, they had a disaster, I believe in the 80s. Check me on that. It was, I think, the 80s. They had dioxins levels so bad they cleared the town. It's a ghost town now. Well, the EPA claimed they had Norfolk Southern test for dioxins. Excuse me. They didn't find anything. Well, independent testers found a whole lot of dioxins here. Why I played that clip, Stephen Petty, again, he's a toxicologist who's been brought in for a lot of environmental disasters. His data has been used in legal cases. To be clear, the attorneys representing these residents hired him, this guy, Stephen Petty, to take the data, to look for chemicals of concern. But they are not sharing his data with the residents. They are saying they can't share his data or what he found, even though they hired him to use the data in a lawsuit on behalf of the residents. So we don't know what he found, and they are claiming that it's up to the judge whether to allow his data through. Does that make any sense to you? You don't have to be a lawyer. The lawyers representing these residents contracted a renowned toxicologist to do the testing for soil, water, see if there's contamination, but they basically have it under seal and will not share it with residents. What did he find? And they're claiming that they can't because some legal mumbo jumbo. That doesn't make sense. Before we get to the residents, I want to bring in a different toxicologist. This is not Stephen Petty, but I want to bring in, his name is George Thompson. He has 55 years of experience as a toxicologist with chemical and hazard assessments. He's worked in government, he's worked in the private sector, schools, you name it. And he has objected to this settlement, the $600 million settlement, and more importantly, through his analysis. This guy was retired, by the way. He came out of retirement because he is so alarmed and so concerned with the nothing to see here, everything's fine narrative coming from the EPA. He came out of retirement, and he has evaluated the East Palestine and Pennsylvania situation. And we're going to bring him in because what that expert just said, he strongly disagrees with. So put the volume on now. Okay. So should I stand over here while I say it, or? Talk. So, George, you are a toxicologist with 55 years of experience.
That's correct.
Hold on. I'm going to mute this. Yeah. Play it off my phone so they could hear it.
No, why don't you keep this going? You talk to him out there.
You sure? So, can you share what your findings have been? Because your findings are this is much more extensive than East Palestine and Western Pennsylvania.
Yes, I can. Can everybody hear me there fine? When I first saw this event on television, I was very intrigued because of the magnitude of the plume and the duration that it lasted, 5 or 6 days. And I was impressed with it from a toxicology viewpoint, but when the EPA and the Ohio EPA came out within 6 to 8 or 10 days and said everything's safe, I knew that that wasn't true. There was too much that I had seen just on television with no data to know that that couldn't have been safe in that short a period of time. So, as already stated, I decided to come out of retirement and devote myself to evaluating this to see what the truth was. The first thing I did was go on the internet and download the manifest for this train that was on Norfolk Southern's website. And that manifest identified 52 cars that were involved in the derailment, and it also identified the contents of each car and what its condition was at that very preliminary time. Now, this is within probably 2 weeks of the start of the derailment. And it would tell which ones burned. And then they used a strange term that to this day, I don't know exactly what it means, but they had another group of cars that were designated as impinged. And I assumed that that meant impinged by fire. And so I had a car-by-car analysis of the contents, what was in them. And I went on the internet and did research then as to what were the hazards of the contents. And of the 52 cars in their manifest, 8 different products, there were 26 different products in the 52 cars. There were 8 products in the cars that were carcinogens, could cause cancer. The only one that I've really heard talked about is vinyl chloride, but there were 7 others. In addition to that, I then researched and said, what happens when you burn the contents in these cars? And frankly, I was a bit stunned because I'd never looked at combustion chemistry and toxicology before this incident. But what I found is that when I looked across all of the cars that were either burned or impinged, that instead of 8 chemicals that could cause cancer, I identified 119 chemicals that can cause cancer. And those cancers occurred in 21 different body and organ systems. So there's lots of types of cancer that could come from this incident. I also calculated how much was involved, and I looked up rail car content, and most of the rail cars carry around 200,000 pounds of material. Some of them are 180,000, some of them are 220,000. But when you multiply that across the cars that were involved in both the burning and impingement, there were over 5 million pounds of materials in cars that Norfolk Southern said burned. There was another 3 million pounds in the cars that they said were impinged. So there was a total of over 8.5 million pounds of chemicals that were spilled, dislodged, and combusted there in East Palestine. The toxicity of those chemicals, hundreds of chemicals now that were released, the toxicity would have been simultaneous. You wouldn't just have been inhaling vinyl chloride, and so then you know that you got to worry about lung cancer. You wouldn't have been inhaling benzene, so you know about blood cancer. You would have been inhaling these vapors and chemical particles all at one time, and they would come into your body. And I haven't totaled up the number, or I've forgotten it, but there are a lot of those chemicals that are calculated, that I calculated what are the combustion products that produce dioxins. It's not just one source. As mentioned here, it isn't just dioxins from vinyl chloride being burned. That's true. But there are dozens and dozens of other chemicals that were burned that produce dioxins. So you would expect that in testing the materials there, the water and soil, the air, that you would find evidence of dioxins. And I was dumbfounded to hear in the early days that that wasn't true. Now we know that that is true. I've actually seen analyses done by Scott Smith that maybe some of you know, where he was given garlic raised in a garden, I think in East Palestine, and the same garden had produced garlic the year before, long before the derailment. And we found very high levels, he found very high levels of dioxins in that garlic. So if the people had eaten the garlic, let alone inhaled the dioxins, but if they'd eaten the garlic, they would have ingested dioxins, and once dioxins are in your body, they stay for a long time, measured in years. They're stored in the fat in your body, and the breadth and depth of their toxicity, they are one of the most toxic chemicals known. And as mentioned, it's what made Agent Orange work in Vietnam. But they last a long time in our bodies and in the environment. So it's not going to go away quickly. Now, the interesting part is that when I heard Dr. Carson's video, until just mentioned here that I heard for the first time, I had overlooked the fact that he was your expert. I thought he was Norfolk Southern's expert because everything he said protected Norfolk Southern. And in my complaint to the court about their agreement, I went question by question. He had 10 questions that I responded to in detail in my submission to the court, where he only stated opinions, generalized, generic opinions that didn't have any data or justification for his opinion. Like he said at one point that he thought that the risk of cancer from this experience was less than 1%. I can't imagine how a statistician could say less than 1% when you had literally 8.5 million pounds of chemicals put up into the air that included 120 chemicals that cause cancer. It's got to be more than 1%. The other thing that that I am concerned about is you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the plume cloud that went up. I've only seen it on TV and pictures of it, but it was massive and it went on for days. And one of the interesting features is that when this accident occurred, there was what's called a temperature inversion. So that plume cloud didn't go up thousands and thousands of feet into the air. It went up to 3,000 feet, is what I've heard recorded, and plateaued off. It didn't go higher than that. It spread out like a pancake. And I've actually seen pictures taken from airliners of that pancake. It's huge. I don't know what dimensions it covered from that picture, but it went up in the air and just sat. And the carbon particles that make that black cloud in the plume have the hazardous chemicals bonded to the particles. So that if any of those carbon particles that settle out anywhere, anytime, are going to have those chemicals still bound to them, whether it's on water or the soil or our bodies. And so that dispersion of that cloud will determine to a large extent how massive this incident was. I call it an apocalypse because in my 55 years of toxicology, watching incidents like this around the world over the half a century, I have never seen an incident as dangerous and as hazardous as this incident in East Palestine. It's the worst I've ever seen in 55 years. I then went into the literature and found a publication by another scientist, group of scientists, that used the NOAA air dispersion model to determine what happened to the plume in East Palestine. Now, you probably all know that the settlement agreement goes out as far as 20 miles. Well, when I saw that plume, and particularly the pictures that showed it plateaued at 3,000 feet and how massive it was, I couldn't imagine why the settlement agreement only went to 20 miles. Where did they come up with that number? Well, this air dispersion model that I found only a few weeks ago, published for East Palestine, showed that the plume cloud was not just dispersed in one area or one direction. It was dynamic and would change from day to day and hours per day. But it did transverse up into southern Canada, went all the way up to Lake Huron and across to Lake Ontario. It encompassed much of New York State, including all the way to Vermont and New Hampshire. It hit the northern tip of New Jersey, where I live, covered all the state of Pennsylvania, and then there were southern portions of it, southeastern portions, that went down through West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. In my calculations, that covered approximately 126,000 square miles. And your proposed agreement is for 20 miles in radius around ground zero. Doesn't account for any of the others. And in my research of this air dispersion, I came across a statement from a family in Ontario, Canada. They live just near Niagara Falls. The same week that you folks were suffering through the fires in East Palestine, this family in Ontario had the same symptoms that have been described in East Palestine. That's a lot more than 20 miles away. And so that the magnitude of concern that I have from a toxicology viewpoint is that this is absolutely unprecedented. The science of toxicology and medicine has no way to account for the hazards or risk associated with simultaneous exposure to hundreds of chemicals. It's never been researched, It's not in the medical literature. They don't know how to interpret it. So for Dr. Carson to say that into the future, he doesn't think there's going to be any impact. There isn't one piece of data anywhere in the world that can tell him that. And I've looked. And so this is unprecedented in the magnitude, the numbers of chemicals involved. It's unprecedented in the quantity, the 8.5 million pounds of chemicals involved. It's unprecedented in the number of different times you were exposed. There was a fire that started early in the week, I think on the 3rd or 4th of February, but then they ignited the vinyl chloride fire on the 6th of February. 2 different times you had fires. And then they did the remediation to clean out the tracks and take all the dirt and stuff out so they can get the railroad running again. And that put dust in the air all over again. And that was all contaminated dust. And if there was no contamination as claimed by the railroad, they can't find the
Hey, George, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Two questions. I just want to make sure, because they're going, so the EPA and Norfolk Southern will try to discredit you. You've been used as an expert in about 50 to 60 cases before?
Yeah, in my retirement, I was actually doing it before I retired, but I retired to becoming an expert witness. And I think the number of cases I've been involved with is up to 56 now. And in some of those expert witness cases, I have been given the opportunity to evaluate other experts on the other side, the opposing experts. In 2 of the cases, I was able to criticize those experts to the point that the judge concurred that they weren't experts. And that would certainly be my interpretation of Dr. Carson. This man was not an expert. And the cases that I've been involved with are all kinds of chemical hazard cases. And I've represented both defendants and plaintiffs in the cases. And I've based it, always my opinions, on what the science told me. Did you have another question, Jordan?
Yes, and the 120 potential cancerous chemicals, would you presume that the EPA is not testing for most of those chemicals?
Well, the answer is yes. I would assume when they tell us that they didn't find dioxins, and I knew there were tons of dioxins put in the air, that either they weren't looking or they weren't looking in the right way or the right places. And I know that in the beginning, when they quickly came out, think back to the very first week when they announced within 8 days or whatever it was that everything was safe, the air was safe, the water was safe, no soil contamination. When they answered that quickly, they had to be talking about air and volatile chemicals that would have dissipated. What they never said is how they did the test, when they did the test, or where they did the test. They just said generically, it's safe. Don't worry about it. And part of my concern here for the people in the immediate area, but I also don't know that it's not the same thing for the people in Canada that were exposed, is that after 9/11, we all knew about 9/11's disaster with the terrorists, predominantly because of the 3,000 people that died on that day. But what we don't hear much about is that since then, 4,300 people have died and 71,000 people have suffered diseases from their exposures on 9/11. I have a tremendous concern that's going to unravel for this case. that people that are exposed, nobody died on February 3rd. And so everybody, it's easy to say, okay, there's no problem here because nobody died. But since then, this spring, I've heard about a fellow in East, I think it's East Palestine, who came down with breast cancer, a man who came down with breast cancer. And just about a month ago, within the last month, I've had a friend of mine who lives in East Palestine tell me that he has 2 brain tumors. Now, some of the chemicals that I've identified in my research are called cancer promoters. In other words, they don't cause cancer themselves, but they change body cells' reaction to other chemicals that promote the creation of cancer. And so with these 2 rapid cases of cancer in the first 15 months or so, it's not a surprise to me, because we have 120 chemicals that I know of that cause cancer, and we have other chemicals that promote cancer. So for some of those to both be in the same person at the same time, it's not a surprise.
That gentleman you mentioned that has cancer is actually here.
I haven't met him, but I've talked to him.
I wanted to ask you, obviously you're not a doctor, but he came down with the cancer 18 weeks after this chemical explosion. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not a surprise. If you go back and study the literature with 9/11, many of the cancers, we normally think that cancer takes 10 or 20 years to form. But that isn't the case after 9/11 either. They had different kinds of cancers, some of which came on very quickly in weeks. And they had others that took months, and then still others that took years. But we have chemicals here, what I call a chemical stew, that we don't even know what's going to happen, because think of it as this way. I've identified hundreds of chemicals that were in that stew. But what I can't find any data on is when you have that many chemicals in a very hot plume, what reactions do they have? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that there's any research on it. So there could be other chemicals formed that were not formed from the starting materials in the railroad cars. It's very complicated.
Now I'm going to just pass the microphone to a resident.
Okay.
Who has a question for you?
Hi, George. We've spoke before. Now, my name's Ashley McCollum. Most of you know me. Now, we did have a waste analysis from the site early on that was conducted by Norfolk Southern, and the lab was Eurofins, and it was early February 2023. And out of the 5,000 pages of chemicals that they had found, there were dioxins, but they regret to inform anyone that there were dioxins found. And that did come out on the 1 year, which 5,000 chemicals is a lot. And most people don't understand, I think we did speak about this, when these chemicals go up into the air, do they stay in the air for a longer duration of time?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is no. The chemicals go up in the air in that plume because they're hot. So hot stuff rises. It rose with the hot air. But in the process of mixing in that plume, in the fire and the plume, the chemicals themselves bind to the carbon particles, what's called soot or ash. That's the blackness of the plume. But think of each of those little microscopic carbon particles as a sponge. It's going to absorb chemicals. And as they're hot, they're going to rise. But when they cool, they're going to start falling out of the sky. And that's why this study of what is the air dispersion is so critical, because it says they could have been distributed over very large areas.
Okay, and now we also, you and I and a couple other people went over some test results that were conducted in some homes. and you did tell me about mine and the presence of vinyl chloride. It was at a 1.8 interior at parts per million, and my exterior was 1.0 parts per million. Is that high in your opinion?
Of course it is. And in the context, you see, I assume that the interior, you're living there. You might have moved, I've forgotten actually whether you did or you didn't, but anybody that goes in that house then is exposed to vinyl chloride. And that's a carcinogen, among other things. It affects a lot of other organs. It isn't just a carcinogen. It's also it's very toxic. But yes, those are levels that you don't want to be exposed to.
Thank you, George.
I have some more residents that want to pick your brain, so hold on one second.
Yeah, this is Kevin Detmer. I lived at 626 East Taggart Street. I'm within a rock throw of the derailment. Our house was tested, but it was tested by the people that were contracted by Norfolk Southern. Okay, I have recently not had my house tested for dioxins, but I had it tested. They took two-sided tape and they pulled it from my counters, from my ceiling fans, and they said that my house, the only thing that they could find is soot and from the controlled burn, if you want to call it a controlled burn. But what I want to know is what is in that soot.
That would have to be analyzed separately. In other words, it isn't, the fact that they found the soot, and we know historically, it's known in the scientific literature, that soot in a fire has the chemicals bonded to it. As I just explained, it's like a sponge. And so those soot particles need to be analyzed to see what chemicals have bonded to them. But that's the transport mechanism for the toxic chemicals in this whole process, is those attached to the soot.
Okay, so my other question would be, is when they were doing this testing, what if they didn't test for the right chemicals or the right dioxins?
If you don't test for it, you won't find it. And that's the problem, I think, with some of that early testing, is that they had a small select group of chemicals they were testing for, and therefore they come out and report that they didn't find any of the really bad stuff.
And George, would you find it problematic that that the EPA initially had Norfolk Southern conducting the testing in the homes of the gentleman that just asked you that question? Norfolk Southern is the one that detonated the chemicals. Should their data be trusted?
It'd be very suspect. And one of the difficulties that I have is that from the reports I've read about, is that some of the methods used were not appropriate methods. I've already talked about the soil, where they mix 6 inches of soil when it's only the surface you want to really look at initially, where it would be most concentrated. And that ends up diluting the soil contamination levels. But it's the same thing with the air. If they come into somebody's home and they do air testing, you need to run the air samples appropriately. And some of these, I think, I've read that they use badges, when in fact, proper air circulation tests would mean that you have a vacuum, a pump, if you will, that sucks air through a tube that binds with the hazardous chemicals. I didn't hear of those methods, but if I were looking at this from the case in a lawsuit, which this is, that's what we're talking about here with the settlement agreement, I would have wanted to look at the methodology. And I think that some of those early methods were what I would call in the trade quick and dirty, and they were designed to show that there weren't chemicals there, as opposed to bending over backwards to see truly if there were chemicals. And Jordan, one thing I'll say to you that I haven't said before to you, Jordan, is that I initially reached out to the law firms involved in the lawsuits on behalf of the plaintiffs to be their expert witness, because I've done so much of that. And I never heard back from any of the law firms soliciting my input, even though I already put my own time of hundreds of hours into the analysis. They wanted to go a different direction, and particularly the ones that handled the lawsuit, I was simply told they want to go a different direction. Conversely, people here, some of you are from Darlington. I don't know if you know, but your Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania has submitted comments to the court saying that this settlement agreement is not adequate. So your Attorney General in Pennsylvania has filed against this this settlement agreement. I don't know what the status is in Ohio.
And did you happen to have spoken with Michael O'Shea? He was one of the plaintiff attorneys?
No. No, I didn't talk to anyone.
I have another question from a resident. This is the wife of Wayne. Wayne, unfortunately, is the gentleman who came down with the double breast cancer, but his wife has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, George. My question for you is, knowing what was in the plume, as you have explained to us, what are the probabilities that there could be absorption in your home if you have blown in insulation in your walls?
I think that to interpret that question a little bit, I think you're asking, could your insulation have absorbed some of the chemicals? And the answer is yes. I've done probably 20 plus lawsuits for spray foam insulation. And one of the things that is commonly determined is that when you spray that in, it's like styrofoam. It goes in as a liquid and then dries like styrofoam. And it's known that it absorbs chemicals. And so I think the answer to your question is that the chemicals that are dispersed are very reactive. And so they could attach to many surfaces. And one of the concerns I had in 2023 is that people would find this dust in their homes and vacuum it out. And I was telling as many people as I could, do not vacuum it, because that's just going to go straight through your vacuum cleaner and back into the air, and you're going to be exposed again.
Hold on one second, George.
Yep.
Okay, George, in our house, we live in an old house built in 1915. And prior to purchasing our home, they had the very old like the shredded paper type of insulation blown into our house. So that's my question is, would that like newspaper type shredded insulation that they blew in, would it absorb those chemicals as that plume went over?
Highly likely, if the air in your house can get to that insulation. In other words, is it open or covered? If it's covered with fiberboard or paneling of some type, then that will reduce the likelihood. But that type of paper insulation would be very would tend to absorb readily moisture.
And George, with the disclaimer that you're obviously not a medical doctor, so you're not making any diagnoses, but I have just within the last few hours interviewed residents who have completely lost their hair, a 35-year-old woman has completely lost her hair. I have interviewed an 18-year-old girl who is having seizures. She was healthy before the derailment and detonation. I have interviewed people who are urinating blood, passing blood through their stools. I've spoken with people who have had strokes. I mean, the list goes on. Memory loss. I interviewed a 55-year-old woman today who now has dementia. And all of these symptoms developed after this detonation, and they were pretty much healthy before this. Obviously, you can't, you're not a doctor, but the 120 cancerous chemicals that you're saying could have been a product of this, are some of the things I just described potentially connected with those chemicals?
Okay, let me back up. Let's forget about the 120 chemicals that cause cancer for now. And let's talk about the other 100 or 200 that have other toxicities, other toxicologic effects in the body. Some of those, for example, all of you probably have experienced the irritation effects. Some of that irritation could be through your noses, in your eyes, through breathing it into your lungs. You've experienced that kind of irritation. That family in Canada, by Niagara Falls, had those symptoms. Those kinds of chemicals also are irritating to the skin. So the skin, eye, nose, throat is common for irritants that those tissues are exposed to. That can lead to so the skin effect can account for the alopecia. The other chemicals that are released, non-cancer effects, affect the brain. I've talked to a number of people myself that have memory loss. I've heard about these strokes, and so there are classes of chemicals in that stew that was released that affect your brain. There are 20 different organs that are affected by the toxicology from the different chemicals released in that stew. And that's going to be unique to each person. Where is your body weak from a chemical resistance basis? And that can vary from person to person. But there are not any of the symptoms that you described here. The bloody urine, that's indicative of kidney problems. There are dozens of chemicals released in that stew that cause kidney problems, that cause liver problems. Almost all of the major body organ systems are affected by those chemicals. It isn't just cancer.
And I also want to ask you, when the media has reported about this, or the politicians have reported about this, they really focused on vinyl chloride. But I'd like to ask you, because you've called this unprecedented, and unless I'm misunderstanding, it seems what's unprecedented about this is people are not just being exposed to one chemical, but a cacophony of chemicals. So there is not many similar situations that you can compare it to where people are being exposed to this many chemicals, which can produce so many different symptoms.
That's absolutely correct. And the only precedent that I know of for this kind of exposure are the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the soldiers might have been camped downwind, and that stuff's burning all the time, and there are multiple chemicals released. But in this particular case, the uniqueness to me is the quantity involved. When I calculated, we're talking 8.5 million pounds that was in those train cars, and there wasn't much left after the fires were all put out. So most of that 8.5 million pounds went in the air, and it didn't go in as the products there. It went in as combustion products. And those combustion products, those chemicals from that combustion, are different than were in the rail cars. So let me give you one example. I think it was 4 of the rail cars were filled with plastic pellets. Now, the plastic pellets in the rail cars are innocuous. You can handle them with your hands. You can shovel them. They're not going to cause any hazardous response. There's no risk to it. But when you burn those, they produce dioxins and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. That's another forever chemical. It produces the soot and the ash that binds all of the different chemicals. There is a group of chemicals called radicals. These are highly reactive that will immediately bind to the soot and ash. It produces aldehydes, all kinds of hazardous chemicals when you burn those plastic pellets. And so the magnitude of the magnification of the risk is unbelievable when they lit the fire. What a bad decision that was. It was a terrible decision. And as the NTSB has said, that wasn't necessary. It was based upon misinformation or incomplete information. We wouldn't have near the problem that I'm concerned about if they hadn't lit that fire.
And George, I just want to read to you something that the so-called expert that is a Chevron, Exxon, and Enbridge and Dow Chemical former employee, that the attorneys for the residents, for whatever reason, used this expert. He said the farther from the derailment, the lower the concentrations were. At the time of the derailment, there was very low wind speed, and the plume of the materials from the derailment moved up high into the air before it contacted the community. The way that comes off to me is if it goes up high enough into the air, it just vanishes, the chemicals, and there's no threat to the humans below. Is there any scientific basis in what that expert said?
Well, he's ignoring the science, and he's ignoring the facts. The fact is that it went 3,000 feet in the air before the temperature inversion stopped it. So if you want to say 3,000 feet in the air is high, okay, I won't argue with that. It's not right on the ground. It's not surface. But what we also know is from the pictures is that cloud at 3,000 feet spread out, and it was flat on the top and it was flat on the bottom. And we know that because of the pictures taken from the airliners. What I can't tell from those pictures is how big an area that pancake spread out. But from the air dispersion models, I've already described the 126,000 square miles that it covered from the air dispersion modeling. And so the areas that were exposed could be far-reaching, and certainly we had one case reported hundreds of miles away at Niagara Falls. So for him to simply say, the further away you get, the less it is, that's normally true. But in this particular case, there was so much released, 8.5 million pounds, that you could be a lot further than 20 miles and not be safe.
I have another question from a resident here.
Hi, my name's Sharon Lynch. It's not really a question. It's just confirming what you both are saying. I'm 16 miles out. I'm on the Pennsylvania side going straight towards Pittsburgh, which I guarantee it made it to Pittsburgh because some of us are interested in weather and had wind map directions pulled up. And so I had gone outside my house. Why they didn't tell anybody to turn their HVAC off, I have no clue. But I knew to turn off my heater. I called my sister and a few relatives to turn theirs off. So I watched that weather inversion, and I watched the wind direction. So it's not just distance from, but it's direction also. And I've only seen that in one place. And when the wind was supposed to change, I went outside at midnight to check to see if the wind had pushed it the other direction yet, and it hadn't. So I got a lung full of chlorine smelling chemicals. I guarantee you most people were in bed. Most people didn't turn their furnaces off either. So I had months worth of sore throat that, you know, it wasn't strep, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. I went to the doctor 3 or 4 times. So I have record of all that, and I have record of a acne-like rash that went down my right arm. So they know that it went way further than 20 miles. And depending on direction from the derailment too, because it went right over me, all the way to Pittsburgh at least, I know. I went back out at 1 a.m. and it seemed to have cleared up, so I went to bed and turned my heat on. But I'm just confirming for you, yes, it does come down out of that cloud. That cloud was hanging over us with chlorine smelling, you know, that's all. We know it went a lot further than they're admitting. That's all.
You see, one thing I would say to the group of you here is if you haven't already created a diary, do it now, even though it's a year and a half later. It's better than if it's 5 years later. But write down what you remember is the chronology and your responses. The event you just talked about right now, if you just recorded what you said and you had that in a written diary, you may want to pull that out 5 years from now and use that as documentation to get coverage for whatever mental or physical effects that you see unfolding in your life. But it's important to have that kind of information and to have a good, thorough physical exam. I understand that one of the problems people have complained about in East Palestine is that the doctors won't give them routine urine tests and things. I've never heard of that before, but if nothing else, just to create a baseline so that if it deteriorates in the future, you've got the documentation that it wasn't always that way. But the challenge, I think, is that this isn't as though it's a one-time exposure. This went on for a week or more there, and I reiterate, then they dug up all the soil, putting dust in the air. Then they decided to blast the stream beds and put it in the air again. And I've tallied at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 incidences where these chemicals are put in the air.
Do you think based on the plume direction, because your analysis has found that the plume of these chemicals travel to at least 8 states as well as southern Canada, from the way, I mean, that sounds to me, I'm not an expert, that it could become one of the biggest environmental disasters in American history. Do you agree with that? And if you agree with that, obviously this is speculation, but if this could be one of the biggest environmental disasters in American history, wouldn't it then also be true that this could be one of the biggest environmental cover-ups in American history?
Yes and yes. My biggest concern, my whole reason to come out of retirement, and the reason I put over 600 hours into this analysis, is that I am seriously concerned that this could be one of the biggest health and environmental disasters that's ever occurred anywhere, and that its effects are going to end up getting spread over the years, and I'm concerned we don't have any way of synthesizing that data. So when people start getting illnesses from all these chemical exposures 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, who's going to be keeping track of that data? I won't even be around then. So that's one of my concerns, is that we won't even learn from the experience. So I'm investing my time and attention now in trying to get people to look at this in a more flagrant mechanism so that they will appreciate it. And I'm most disappointed that in my experience, my scientific experience, this is the worst disaster I've ever seen. and yet you don't even read about it in the newspapers anymore. Nobody's concerned about it. Or if you get a headline, or Jordan, if your video here gets published, it'll make the news cycle and it'll be gone again. And that's not going to help anybody exposed anywhere. This needs to be carefully scrutinized by an independent group of scientists.
Quick questions before I let you go. Number one, based on everything we're talking about, shouldn't these residents in East Palestine, in Western Pennsylvania, in the immediate zone, we could also talk about beyond 20 miles, but just in the immediate zone, shouldn't they be permanently relocated and bought out of their homes for those that want to leave based on the chemical threats, the symptoms already? Doesn't that just make common sense that they should be relocated and their homes should be bought out? Secondly, I mean, isn't it the government's responsibility to provide them free health care and ongoing medical testing?
Well, let me say that in March of 2023, so a month or two after this incident, I was saying publicly that they needed to abandon the town of East Palestine the same way they did the town of Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach, Missouri was bought out and abandoned 10 years after they knew there were dioxins there. So a lot of people got sick from that. But eventually they bought out and closed down the town. That was only dioxins. We're not talking about one chemical here, the way Times Beach was. We're talking about a whole stew of chemicals that were released in a very, very large quantity. And so I do believe that one of the things that I have proposed for the court is to think about the concept of requiring Norfolk Southern to buy out the homes and businesses of all those people who want to leave. Because if I lived there, I can tell all of you personally, if I lived in East Palestine now, I would leave. I wouldn't take any chance. Now, I recognize, and I've talked to dozens of people, that that's not possible for them. Well, let's make it possible then. Let's get the court to decide that that's got to be part of the agreement. And let's get the federal government to hold their feet to the fire instead of helping to minimize the impact on Norfolk Southern. And as far as free medical coverage, I think that ought to be a requirement. I think there is a provision for that in the settlement agreement for Norfolk Southern to pay for medical follow-ups. But it has a dollar limit, I think, of $25 million, and it has a uncertainty as to whether they would be required to renew that, or if they spend $25 million, that's the end of the health monitoring program. That health monitoring program should be mandated for citizens in the area for at least 30 years, and maybe more.
And how far out for residents, if they were able to leave, how far out would you recommend leaving, not just East Palestine, but the Western Pennsylvania area, right over the border?
Well, I'm not going to cut it off at 20 miles. Let me put it differently. The concept that the further away you are from ground zero, the lower the concentration is generally true. But there was so much released here, that this poundage, 8.5 million pounds, that I don't know how far that would be. So if I had symptoms or I had concerns for me or my family, and I was 50 miles away, I would relocate if I had the means to do that. It's just not a chance worth taking, because this is serious stuff. And the other thing I'll emphasize is that they found at Time Beach that the problems weren't just with the residents, but with their children and their grandchildren. This passed through the generations, because these are forever chemicals. And so, some of you people here probably have children, but think about your grandchildren too that aren't even here yet. And some of these chemicals have hormonal effects and affect the reproductive process in men and women. And if that gets passed on to the next generation, even though I've heard many people say what a wonderful place it is to live in East Palestine, in particular, Darlington, I've talked to several people from there too, but you have to think long term.
So I do have another question about the homes. So a lot of the homes around this area were built around the early 1900s, and a lot of the homes have the paper insulation, horsehair plaster, some even have asbestos siding. So if we wanted to, would it be possible to gut our homes and try to live in them chemically free? Or do you think that's not possible? Because that's been a toss-up. Some people think they can, and from the symptoms I get in my home and as quickly as I get them, I'm not very confident, and I'm afraid if I would spend the money to do something like that, would it be a waste?
You see, let me see if I can explain it more simple than it is. The answer to your question is a complex answer, but the first question is, how much is too much exposure? Now, you folks have lived in this environment now for 1.5 years. So whatever you got in your bodies is already there. And so if you moved away, it's like quitting smoking. Once you quit smoking, you eliminate the risk significantly within months and years afterwards. And that's kind of what I'm looking at here. I can't do anything about what you've been exposed to in the last 1.5 years. But if you moved away, then I do know that you're not going to be exposed anymore. But that doesn't mean you won't get lung cancer. People who quit smoking still can get lung cancer years later. And that's the same thing with the chemical exposure here. And so if you are thinking of cleaning up your house, Ashley, the question is, how do you do that? If you got your house and you put new siding on, or do you paint over it? Do you use a sealant kind of paint to try and seal any chemical residue there that you seal it in? Some of those products may have similar kinds of things you've already been exposed to, because they've all got chemicals. And so it's a question of magnitude. Is it easier to negotiate somebody buying you out and moving away to where you anticipate it would be safer? Or is it more feasible for you to put the effort in to try and clean up where you're living to the lowest level that you can as far as minimizing your future exposures? Because the longer you're exposed, the worse it can be.
See, I did ask that as a broad question because people do ask that a lot, and some have done extreme makeovers to their home for that. And I think a lot of what's not being talked about, as well as mental health. And for me to even do those things, mentally I'm going to keep thinking, am I still exposing myself? Did I bring mud into my home that's clean? Is this almost like radon? And there's so many unanswered things. So a lot of people aren't understanding. Myself, I have OCD, so I would constantly think that.
Well, the mental aspects of this is a big thing. I talk to people all the time that worry and they're anxious about it. And part of the cover-up, if you will, where you don't have the information conveyed to you in a specific fashion, only adds to that anxiety. And so I'm sensitive to it. I hear it enough, and I think that's human nature. But in that context, actually, let's say with your OCD, you could clean up your house so that physically you may not be exposed anymore, but mentally you're still going to be exposed, not to the chemicals, but to the anxiety and to what that place represents. And so that becomes a personal decision based upon your own makeup and your own circumstances. But these are all complexities that I don't think were discussed at all in the settlement agreement.
George, can I ask you, President Biden has not issued a disaster declaration for East Palestine. It's the same thing when the Flint water crisis happened. President Obama did not issue a disaster in Flint. They claim that they can't issue disasters because legally that's only for natural disasters. Well, I argue that, but bottom line, should a disaster be declared in East Palestine, Western Pennsylvania? Because if it's declared a disaster area, obviously there's a ton more resources and federal government resources that could come in here.
I thought that there should have been a federal disaster notification within a week or two after the incident, after the derailment. If the ground rules, the law, if you will, doesn't allow it to be intervened, now under recent rulings from the Supreme Court, I guess I would raise the question, is that a law or is that a regulation developed by FEMA? You know, who set the ground rules for when you can declare it a national disaster? And I suspect it's a regulation. And the Supreme Court recently ruled that the agencies have too much power to write regulations that weren't intended by Congress. And if they weren't, then those regulations don't apply. But, you know, you're a year and a half after this, and that's something that your governor and your senators and representatives should be crying to the skies about, is to get that disaster relief for you people there within some substantial distance, probably more than 20 miles by far, from the ground zero, so that it would be encompassed, and those federal funds from many different agencies would then flow to your community.
Oh, this is Kevin Detmer again. I have a question on the controlled burn. When they did that controlled burn and they blew up those 5 tanker cars, how much of that liquid that was in the rail cars have burnt, and how much of it would have gone down into the soil?
Well, there probably is no way to know that because we don't have any measured data. But what we do know is that those 5 tanker cars with vinyl chloride had about 1 million pounds total of vinyl chloride. There are about 200,000 pounds in each of those cars. And so with 5 of them, that's 1 million pounds. A large amount of it would have burned, but it also would have taken a long time so that some of it could have soaked down into the soil. And I understand from others, I haven't seen anything published, but I understand through other stories that they are still finding pockets of vinyl chloride in the community. I don't have any details about it or how much there is, but I know that's a concern, that there could be areas where that's still being retained.
And George, my last question, your toxicology opinion and just common sense opinion, should this $600 million settlement go through, or does it need to go back to the drawing board and be a lot more resources than $600 million?
Well, I wrote a 10-page document that said it should not go through. And I gave very specific science-based reasons for each phase of it that I thought should not go through. And I can say that I'm still stunned to learn today from you, Jordan, that this physician was for the plaintiffs, because his 10 questions that he responded to, I wrote detailed responses to each of his 10 questions. And I thought for certain that he was representing the defendants in this. But there is just no credibility that I've found in any element of this. Whether you're talking about measurements, procedures used, everything to me looks like there was a cover-up. And to my mind, this needs to have an independent commission, if that's the right term, but an independent body overseeing this, like maybe the National Academy of Science or something, that would look at rethinking this whole process. The one thing that was stated in the town hall meeting a week or so ago, put on by the attorneys for the plaintiffs, was they were very proud how fast this had happened. And it's been a year and a half now that you've been exposed. I don't think speed is what you want. I think what you want is a well-considered, well-documented circumstance, and putting as much of the burden back on Norfolk Southern as possible. This is a $12 billion a year business. $600 million of this settlement agreement is going to be spread over 20 to 25 years. That's not even going to infect them at all. So there's lots of room, and I don't know that I said it before, I might have overlooked it, but a year ago in March, I proposed that they should set a $1 billion fund up to fund you people so that you could move your homes and businesses to safer places if you chose. Now, that was a year ago, and that was intended to be an initial fund. Now they're talking about $600 million spread over numerous years. So I just think it's grossly inadequate. And I'm very concerned as to why it was so important to do this quickly. And the primary motivation that I see is you've got attorneys that are going to see a third of this go into their pockets. They're going to get the biggest share of this, and it's in their benefit, as it would be in any business, to get that money in their pockets as fast as they can. But I don't see why the court should have facilitated that. The court should have looked at this other opinion.
And George, one more question, sorry. There were electric cars on the train, electric cars with lithium batteries.
Yes.
There's been problems in other parts of Ohio with burning of these cars and these lithium batteries. If electric cars, I don't know the exact number, I think between 5 and 10. If electric cars with lithium batteries burned, isn't that ionization burning? And what are the health impacts of that?
Well, lithium-ion batteries and the other community is Pequot in Ohio. I'm working with them on that issue, that very issue of burning lithium-ion batteries. I just gave them a presentation yesterday on that. And I didn't know in the beginning that what was called the car rack train car had electric vehicles on it. But in looking at that, you're talking about releasing some of the most toxic chemicals, and many of you have experienced irritation, could come from that source because it releases all kinds of acidic materials, one of which is lithium fluoride, hydrogen fluoride, which is such a corrosive acid that it will etch glass, and it releases hydrogen chloride, which is another very corrosive chemical. So the batteries, when they burn, the chemicals that are released are very, very toxic, and you don't want to breathe those in because there are several components in the fumes of a burning lithium-ion battery that can kill you, literally, just by inhaling it. So that is a very serious component. It was only one carload, as I understand, but there's a lot of chemicals released from the batteries in those cars.
Well, George, I think you've made a lot more friends in East Palestine and Pennsylvania tonight. I'm sure they're going to be contacting you. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise, and also coming out of retirement. You could be chilling on a beach, but you are spending countless hours on behalf of these residents. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, and we'll talk again soon. All right, I'm still live. So, yeah, I don't know where to start, but I'll just start with the human element. I saw a lot of your faces during that. Some of it was disbelief. Some of it was holding back tears. Some of it was betrayal. Some of it was confusion. But most of all, I think I saw kind of a relief, because everything you've suspected and all the government bullshit and gaslighting and lies, it seems that that was just kind of validated by an expert, the kind of expert the lawyer should actually be using. Whatever you want to say, obviously we want to get some of your stories too, but tell us what you thought of George's presentation.
Well, I definitely think...
I just want to, Chrissy lives over Sulphur Run, correct? Yes. Which is probably one of the most contaminated parts of East Palestine. I was there in April, and my eyes were burning just over that creek. And we went into the house, I don't know, for 20 seconds, and I had to walk out. So just wanted to let people know who you are.
Yes. Well, I wanted to say that I definitely think that these attorneys should fire their PR firm, like I fired the lead attorneys, because the gaslighting that they are now giving these residents in this class action puts the EPA and Norfolk's gaslighting to shame that we've dealt with for a year and a half. So that is ridiculous to use that doctor and to look at these people and tell them that this is the best they could do. We've heard over and over from the DOJ, from the EPA, from the attorneys in the class. Norfolk's attorneys are really tough. Well, do you want us to take up a collection to get you a gym membership? Because you should toughen up. You're the Department of Justice. You should toughen up as lead attorneys that made a bunch of promises to residents to sign them up. So I just feel like they have the new award in gaslighting victims of this open burn and the derailment and the EPA cover-up. So, I mean, they're just added to our list. Definitely. They got first place now.
And just so you know, because there might, you know, with everything, there's distraction and deflection and bullshit on all sides. And there's going to be EPA people who maybe respond to this trying to discredit George or trying to discredit me or whatever. But this ain't my first rodeo. And the bottom line is there's a historical record of the EPA, shall we say, not being the most transparent with the public. I give you the Flint water crisis, which is ongoing 10 years later. To be clear, it's still a crisis in Flint. I don't want them to be the next Flint. That's why I'm here. So the EPA knew, in the case of Flint, that the Michigan Environmental Department was not adding the proper corrosion control chemicals into the water, and they did not notify the residents. They just hid behind bureaucracy and emailed each other, but they did not take action to notify the residents. The EPA knew there was a massive outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in Flint. That's the deadly waterborne bacteria. They did not notify the residents. They did not. What is the point of having a federal government if the state government is doing wrong and you don't step in? What is the point? I don't want to have a debate between federal government and states' rights. This is about life or death, not federal government or states' rights. This is about children. You heard reproductive problems. There might be women who cannot have children now. So what is the point? Why did the EPA allow Norfolk Southern to control the emergency response here? I have sources on the ground who have told me Norfolk Southern was calling the shots the night of the fire, not the fire chief, who was out of town at the time. So the point is, there is a historical record of the EPA either looking the other way as corporations manipulate data or state environmental departments. Hell, I know from the case of Flint, the EPA sent testers in to test Flint residents' water, and they tested the water in the afternoon when it was already in use. You're not supposed to test water. It's supposed to be stagnant for 6 hours, and then you put the sample bottles in. The EPA went into residents' homes and were testing the wrong way. So you could say, oh, they're intentionally corrupt, or they're just a bunch of fucking idiots. Who knows? But the point is, the EPA has been on the ground here. If Mark Durno is watching, he's with the EPA, and they're basically telling residents, don't believe your lying skin. Don't believe your lying pee out of your blood. Don't believe your burning eyes. Don't believe the tingling on your lips, the tingling through your bodies. If you're the 18-year-old I interviewed, don't believe the seizures you're having. You were healthy before. If you're the 66-year-old man who was fine before this, sorry you got double breast cancer, but hey, there's no proof it's from this. I mean, I could go down the list. So I'm not saying this, to have a pep rally. I'm saying this because there's conspiracy theorists, and then there's just common sense and obvious. And the reason I really value going on the ground to places, and it's very expensive. And by the way, that's not what makes money. If you want to be a journalist and make money, you don't go to East Palestine or Flint. I can tell you that. But the reason I value going on the ground is because it's one thing to talk to people on the phone or do interviews remotely. It's another thing when you go somewhere and experience it yourself. I came here for the first, Lewis, my colleague, came here 5 times and did great work. But I came here in April. Within 2 minutes of walking into a home, I had a splitting headache. I got a lot of problems, but I don't get headaches. I had a splitting headache within 2 minutes of walking into a home. Stella, where is she? A mile from the derailment, maybe less. I had a massive headache. Then, when we interviewed Stella and her husband, I asked them to turn the what was that, John? The fan off and all that, the air purifiers off, because it was picking up on the audio, so it would have distorted the interview. You couldn't hear her. She turned off the fan. My headache went from like a 6 out of 10 to a 12 out of 10. I felt delirious. Like, did I just have 3 shots of whiskey? They're living there. I get to leave. Meanwhile, the EPA is telling everything's fine. By the way, we found that the EPA, they acknowledged their testing equipment is not capable of finding low levels of chemicals. Norfolk Southern, when they were testing, they were using measurements and equipment for industrial disasters, like in a warehouse and a factory, not like testing the air outside. I mean, I could go down the list. I found a few weeks ago, where the hell is the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette? Where is the Cleveland Plain Dealer? Where is the New York Times, the Washington Post? I found that the EPA here found vinyl chloride in the soil and just forgot to tell you. They didn't tell anyone that they found vinyl chloride. And they found vinyl chloride in the soil, I don't know when. They told me early spring. Well, what does that mean? They told me it was low levels. I asked them, can you provide the levels? Nope. And I know for a fact that other reporters, including the Associated Press, by the way, confirmed my story. They confirmed that it was accurate. I had text messages. I had the EPA confirming they found it, but no other media outlet reported it. What else are you working on that's more important than the federal government literally, after telling these folks for a year and a half, we're not finding the toxic, cancerous gas that we detonated, that they found it and then didn't? That's called a cover-up. I'm just at a loss. I mean, Flint was bad, and I stay on Flint. But this is like a mini Chernobyl here. I mean, that's basically what the toxicologist was telling you. And the media is not covering it anymore. What is Norfolk Southern, like, pay your bills if you're a journalist? Not exceptions can be made. We have a local journalist here. But It's just astounding. I know if you're a journalist, you have to eat and you have to feed your kids, but go do something else to feed your kids if you're going to bury this, because you're literally burying people. You are allowing people to be slowly poisoned. And it's not slowly. Listen, I'm not a doctor. I can't say cause and effect, but it's pretty unusual for men to get breast cancer. What is it? 1 out of 800?
1 out of 833.
1 out of 830 men get breast cancer. Wayne got double breast cancer and had to have a double mastectomy, and he's got other problems now too, symptoms-wise. And frankly, call me a conspiracy theorist. I think it's common sense. I think Norfolk Southern wants to settle as quickly as human possible before all of you have cancer and their bill goes way the fuck up. So that's the end of my monologue. If anyone else wants to say anything, I'd love to know what you thought. I'd also love to know, not love, but can you share, because they're saying it's safe, they're saying they're not detecting these things. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, what are your symptoms? Because some of you have been able to get out temporarily and your symptoms have cleared up, but some of you are stuck here and your symptoms are bad. Just share your name.
Hi, I'm Candy Keel. My husband was just recently diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease. And they are doing tests for him for lung cancer. We're waiting on the results for that. We live in Palestine.
Was he fairly healthy before this?
Yes. Yeah, he was. And he's probably dropped 40 pounds.
He's lost a lot.
And he's tall.
Yeah, he's 6 foot. So, but he still works. He works right by the train tracks at Strohekers. Do I believe it's safe? No. I know it's not. But what can we do? Because he was going to retire and he didn't. So that's my situation right now.
I think Norfolk Southern should buy the business. That's just my thought.
Did the doctors, because one of the things that's always amazed me in Flint and other places like this, the doctors, when you go see them, it's like they're ghosts.
Oh, yeah.
And they just can't say anything, and they record none of it. They can't tell you whether this could be connected. Sometimes they say, I can't see you for this anymore. You could put 2 and 2 together on that one, but did the doctors say this could be connected, or we don't know? By the way, was your husband like a massive drinker or smoker or, all this?
No, he wasn't. And doctors haven't said nothing. They just look at you. You know they want to say something, but they can't. So that's what we deal with.
And how's your health?
Oh, I stress. So.
And to the women here, you don't have to tell me about you personally if you're not comfortable, but I've heard, to the females here, you don't have to tell me about you personally, but I've heard a lot of stories about women having irregularities in their menstrual cycle or reproductive issues.
I think just about every one of us here has.
Okay, well, I'm not trying to get up in your business, but if you could share that, because that's a common issue happening.
I know I'll try to just give some symptoms that I know all of us have had. Inflamed lymph nodes in the groin area. Christina and I have had that. Periods that go for 10 days to 14 days now. 4 months for some, the never ending. Some has stopped. Blood clots, passing blood clots that are very alarming. This is happening to young teenagers. It is happening 20s, 30s, 40s. I had went to a doctor and they instantly said, "Oh, well, it's menopause." They said, "Test me for that." "Oh, we don't have a test for menopause." "Yes, you do. Test me for that." Well, no, there's no test for that. So I went to my family doctor. I said, can you test me for menopause? He did. He said, you're not in it. No, I'm not. So the issues going on with women and their cycles is happening a lot to a lot of people in Pennsylvania, Darlington, Unity, East Palestine. It's Norfolk's gift that keeps on giving.
There is children that are probably around 10 years old that have started that early. So some people have complained about that as well. The younger kids are starting a lot earlier and going through different kinds of hormone problems as well, even acne. And my son gets acne, and he's 8. He was getting it at 7. So we're seeing hormonal problems, and almost all of the women that I've talked to have had some type of issue one way or another.
So I'm certainly no expert on the female system, but usually you would have your first period like 12, 13, right?
It depends.
As women?
Some people do start earlier, but we're just hearing a lot more than normal. So here and there you'll have someone that starts maybe at 10, but we're hearing handfuls of kids.
And we're also, I interviewed earlier a 35-year-old woman who lost her hair, and she's saying she knows 4 other people in the area, 30s, 40s, 50s, that are now losing their hair. So you have from younger people having earlier menstrual cycles to periods that go on for 4 months, periods that stop. I mean, this is pretty alarming. Yet they're telling you it's what? Coincidence?
Stress. It's stress. It's in our heads. We're overthinking it. We shouldn't be worrying so much. We're doing this to ourselves. Hair falls out because of stress. Your cycles can be messed up because of stress.
Did you want to say something, Wayne?
Kinda.
Just let it out, man.
You know what? Mark Durno is a piece of shit. Plain and simple.
He's with the EPA.
Yes, he is with the EPA. We have found some heroes in this, though. We have Senator Mascherano. This is not even his district. From Pennsylvania, has held 2 hearings, one at the fire hall and one at the college. Our own state senator, Vogel, the only difference between him and a bucket of shit is the bucket. Because he couldn't get out of that meeting fast enough. Don't tap my chair, woman, because I'm talking.
You've been quiet.
I've been quiet because you said before what you see in everybody's eyes. Do you see what's in my eyes? Anger. I'm angry and I'm frustrated because we have reached out for help. All these people have reached out for help, and all of them got it worse than me, and nobody's there to help them.
We're here for each other, though.
Yeah, we are here for each other. I've met so many friends since this tragedy happened. You know.
And I know we talked earlier, but you're also worried about your grandkids because.
Yeah. And my daughters. We want to give our house to our daughters and our grandkids. What are we doing to them?
By a show of hands, if financially they bought you out, by a show of hands, would you all choose to leave?
Probably, yeah.
Even with what they're giving us with the settlement, it does sound like a lot. And then you think of all the people, and then you think of all the medical expenses we've already went through, and some of the stuff that's not being reimbursed, or you're not hearing from everyone. So with this lawsuit, we'll potentially have to pay back what we took for relocation. And on another page that...
I want to, 1 second. I want to make sure people understand that because it's so fucking absurd. So...
It was a gift.
So obviously there's quite a lot of people that temporarily relocated. A good amount of people were in a hotel for a year. Norfolk Southern reimbursed them. But as part of this settlement, my understanding is if per resident you're going to get around $70,000, from the $70,000, the reimbursement is going to be deducted from that $70,000. Is that correct?
Yeah, per household. And there is also a part.
Then it's not reimbursement. It's a loan.
We're going to help you, but then we're going to take it back from you. And I had that feeling this whole time. And if anyone knows anything, you better fight with your attorneys, because I'm not in the class action. That was a gift. They had gifted that. They gave it to you. Nothing attached. Now they can't take it back, and that is absurd that the judge is even allowing that. And on top of that, if these people do this class action, there's a chance they'll have to pay back their insurance for anything that was done. Yes. So that is in those forms, and these guys don't know. And we're sitting here reading it. Some people shut it off and don't think about it. This is every day we hear something new, people reaching out to each other. So that money sounds good, $70,000 and then $129,000 for medical. Once you get down to it, you got barely nothing. Good luck. Now you've got some air purifiers, and you can pay for the cancer or the sickness that you had and the gaslighting that the doctor gave you and be in debt for the rest of your life.
Yeah. But also, if you're lucky enough to have health insurance, okay, but even with health insurance, if you get cancer or something like that, there's bills that are going to come with that. And then if you get too sick to work, because we lived in a fucked up country, you lose your health insurance. So as part of this settlement, they say that there's some expansion of healthcare, some expansion of testing, but there seems to be a lot of fine print. Bottom line, it's not free healthcare. It's not free healthcare. And I will also point out that Libby, Montana had an asbestos disaster. The year is escaping me. I think it was in the early the 2000s. And a lot of people died. And as part of Obamacare, the fight to get that law passed, the senator from Montana said to the president, I'll give you my vote, but you have to give my people free health care. By the way, rightly so. They should have got free health care. So they have free health care in Libby, Montana. Well, why don't these people have free health care? I think I know why. Just like I think I know why they capped it at a 20-mile radius. Yeah. Because this goes well beyond the people of East Palestine. Of course, the people in the immediate zone are going to be the most affected, but at the end of the day, why wouldn't they have free health care, not just free health care, but free ongoing testing? Because like the toxicologist said, some cancers will show up within months, weeks. Some might show up 2 years, 5 years. But you need preemptive testing for those things. So I don't know who these lawyers are. If you're watching, I'd be happy to talk to you, even if you won't do it on the record. I'd be happy to talk to you on background. But it seems pretty shoddy work to be, that's a kind way of putting it, to accept those terms, specifically that they would have to pay back reimbursement. And by the way, it's pretty exploitive too. And let me explain why. This is a poor area. So I think what they're banking on is $70,000. If you're low income, it's a good amount of money. That might be more than people make in 2 years. So, but it's not $70,000 if you got to pay back the reimbursement and you got bills up the wazoo for your health problems, relocation, et cetera, et cetera. You want to say something?
That's not it. There's more. So if you are low income and you have some kind of disabilities, right, there's a chance that you could lose your assistance that you had before as soon as you get this money. So not only are we screwed with all these other things, they're taking it from every side and coming at us. That's what they're doing because they're going to lose it.
And by the way, I just want to say, and I want to be clear, I'm not reporting this. I don't know if this is for fact, and I have to check it. So this is pure speculation, and I admit that. However, I have heard from more than one person that the $600 million figure is actually what Norfolk Southern is getting from its insurance company. Yes. So Norfolk Southern putting out the $600 million, again, I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard it from enough people, so I will follow up on it. But that is their insurance claim. So basically, they could be coming out making money on this. But I digress.
Hi. Just to confirm, both of the lawsuits that are going right now, the class action and the Justice Department lawsuit, are a slap in the face. You have monitoring for health, and you have monitoring of wells. We don't need a referral to a cancer doctor. I can get my own referral. There is no provision for if you get that cancer. There is no provision in 5 years, 1 year, we don't know, your well turns up with these chemicals. There is no provision. All there is we're going to monitor it. Tell me how that's fair. What world are we living in?
Because they know that.
I just don't understand.
I'll tell you. I will tell you. I will tell you exactly. I will tell you exactly what world we're living in. The United Corporations of America. Explain this to me. And this isn't me on my high horse. I just truly, it makes no sense. If Norfolk Southern had a derailment, okay? I understand that the fire chief was not in town. You know, he's entitled to a vacation or whatever. So the fire chief's out of town. Why was Norfolk Southern controlling the immediate emergency? I've spoken with firefighters. I've spoken with people here. Norfolk Southern was controlling the emergency response, even when the EPA was on the ground. Make it make sense.
Because they, if I remember correctly, Norfolk Southern said they were in the train business and they knew what they were doing.
Clearly by the derailment.
Yeah, 250 years of train experience, so they were in control and they were going to take care of it.
And the government let them do a CERCLA. So a lot of people don't know, CERCLA is basically putting them in charge of the cleanup, and whatever the EPA does for them, for the cleanup to help, Norfolk has to pay them back. And basically they can do what they're doing right now with that CERCLA.
That's why they don't want to do us free health care or anything, because that would shut them off. Am I right?
Well, I think it would also set a precedent for other disasters that they don't want to set a precedent that we could actually help people. So they don't want to do that. Christina, you've been quiet. You want to say anything? Okay. Oh, she said, okay. Hold on 1 second.
How many times has the EPA been here in 6 months? Does anybody know?
They do have a location, and if you call them and tell them to come here, they'll do it. But if you're having a problem where half your body goes numb in front of them, they're going to ignore it and say it's in your head. Yeah. So them being there doesn't really matter. No. And if you ask them certain questions, it will change later.
But I just want to point out, Kevin, right? I just want to point out, Kevin and his wife, they literally, I mean, the train was literally at their fence. Their backyard was the train. They are ground zero. And correct me if I'm wrong, EPA never came to your house? No. The only people that came was Norfolk Southern to do the testing. They told you everything's fine. Meanwhile, you were having bloody noses. You have severe memory issues now. And you can't live there. You've had to leave.
Right. And we have to pay $900 in rent for a house that is already paid off.
Property taxes on that house.
And pay on,
even living in either, too.
So,
on top of it.
But if just common sense again, if you're the EPA, wouldn't the most important areas and homes to test be ground zero? But they have not come.
No one ever came to our house from the EPA. Not one.
Just Norfolk Southern.
Yes. And that was on day 3 when they were trying to say that all the houses were fine and everything was back to normal.
And just to be clear, when I say Norfolk Southern, I mean CTEH, which was the contractor they used. Look up CTEH and the Gulf oil spill, because the CTEH is kind of the corporate cleanup crew where they manipulate data and claim everything's dandy. That's who Norfolk Southern used.
You know what? BlackRock is not blameless in this. They own
Say it again.
BlackRock is not blameless in this. And Vanguard, because they own Norfolk Southern.
They're the biggest shareholders.
Yes.
Do you know who got a lot of money from Norfolk Southern?
Sure as hell won't me.
The Ohio governor, Mike DeWine, several senators.
See, that's what I'm saying. This is not a red or blue thing. It's nothing to do with it.
Green thing?
No, it's a life thing.
It's a human.
It's a life or death situation here. And it's, by what I've been hearing, just today, I've heard stuff I haven't heard. I've heard stuff I haven't heard about little kids. Oh my God.
We've been failed, everyone has been failed by our federal government, our state government, our county governments, our local governments, even the alphabet soup agencies that were involved, CDC, EPA,
CDC people got sick here and just left without telling anyone.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And of course, we went to the meeting that they had, and they told us, we know you've been exposed to vinyl chloride. We can't do anything about that, but we could treat the cancer that you'll get from it.
That's on video.
Yeah. So everybody who is under this umbrella of where this happened has been failed in every way possible. Do we expect them to come and save us? Myself personally, no, because I know better than that. But I didn't ask for this. None of these people asked for this. Nobody in the 20 mile, the 8 states, wherever it is, asked for any of this. Where is the holding them accountable? Where is holding them accountable? When does that start?
That was one thing that we've talked about before we actually mentioned today. If I wrecked my car in somebody's front yard, and me and Ashley have talked about this. If I wrecked my car in somebody's front yard, am I going to have to pay for those damages?
Damn right.
I might be put in jail.
In America? Well, yes, you would.
Yeah.
If we fled the scene of the accident.
Yeah, if we flood the scene, we'll just unhook. Nah, see ya.
Yep, we're out of here. If we did that, we're going to jail.
Money talks, bullshit walks.
Let me bring it over here. This is Christina. She lives about, correct me, 5.9 miles away from East Palestine in the Pennsylvania side. And you've had health problems. Your kid had health problems. You've been in the creek quite a bit doing some civilian testing. Tell us what you think about everything going on.
To say about the accountability, a lot of people don't know that in Pennsylvania we still don't have our Attorney General seeking out charges against Norfolk Southern for anything with this. And I just spoke with...
Really? Wait a minute, because your governor was just all the rage. He was almost vice presidential nominee. And he, right after this, I recall, he asked for a criminal referral to your Attorney General to look in, to investigate Norfolk Southern. That was right away. We're now 18 months later, but you're telling me they're not investigating?
And I found out from somebody else in our area that's in government that they had decided that maybe it would be best to not do a litigation, but try to get something without litigation. So that's why they hadn't done anything yet.
So try to get a settlement?
Yeah,
like
through Norfolk Southern.
Keep it quiet.
Yeah. And so today I was speaking with people with the EPA too, and they had said that they heard kind of like the same thing. But they had received a letter from Shapiro, our governor, and our Attorney General in objection to their settlement.
To Ohio settlement.
To EPA settlement.
Right.
Yeah. 380 million.
Well, let's just point out, I'm not trying to get political. I'm not trying to get political, but the bottom line is, J.D. Vance is senator for Ohio. He's running for vice president. Trump, if he gets reelected, I mean, he's on a steady diet of cheeseburgers and Diet Coke. So he's an older guy too. So it's not beyond the pale that J.D. Vance one day could be president. And in March, J.D. Vance was in a Senate hearing. I'm sure some of you have seen this. J.D. Vance was in a Senate hearing. The chair of the NTSB testified. The chair of the NTSB, who's one of the only good people involved in this, she told Senator Vance that Norfolk Southern unnecessarily detonated those 5 cars of vinyl chloride. She told J.D. Vance that they ignored repeated warnings from the owner of the chemicals on the car, who were on the ground, by the way. They were there. They kept warning Norfolk Southern that the cars are cooling. There's no need to blow them up. Just let it cool down, which would have taken a little longer, which would have meant Norfolk Southern loses more money. What a sin. And she basically told J.D. Vance that they blew off the experts' warnings. They blew up the cars anyway. They hid from Governor DeWine. They did not tell Governor DeWine when they were advising him to sign off on this controlled burn. They did not tell the governor or the fire chief that the owner of the chemical cars was advising against doing it. Isn't that kind of important information to share, that the experts on the ground are saying you don't need to do this? J.D. Vance's own words were, it sure seems like this town might have been poisoned to open up the rail lines quicker. That was in March. I've contacted his office, in fairness, also Senator Sherrod Brown's office, also Senator Bob Casey's office, Senator John Fetterman's office, Ohio Governor DeWine's office, Attorney General of Ohio Dave Yoss's office, a couple other offices I can't remember. And I've just asked them a simple question. In light of the NTSB, so the federal government, finding that Norfolk Southern intentionally and unnecessarily chemically nuked East Palestine and Western Pennsylvania, should there be a criminal investigation? I didn't even ask for charges. Just look. An investigation. Only Sherrod Brown's office got back to me. It wasn't pretty. It was a bunch of word salad. They did not answer whether there should be an investigation. J.D. Vance, Mr. Hillbilly Elegy or whatever, Mr. Populist, didn't get back to me. No, nobody got back to me. It just seems there's all this rage right now about Boeing and their criminality, and rightfully so. Honestly, I think there's more evidence against Norfolk Southern than Boeing. How much money are they giving that you stay silent? I know Sherrod Brown's up for re-election. I know some of these people are up for re-election, but is that really more important than everything you're hearing here?
It must be.
And the media, my God. I mean, literally, I don't live here. I have residents calling me all the time. I don't mind it because they can't get local media to respond. Oh, no. I know local media has been gutted and there's layoffs and you're all stretched too thin, but Jesus, there is not a more important story I know about than a mini Chernobyl. And that's how it was described to me by a toxicologist. I mean, the guy from the Associated Press says to me, after I broke that the EPA was covering up that they detected vinyl chloride, that they didn't tell the public, he said, yeah, I emailed him. He said, yeah, I checked in on that. I confirmed your story. I'm working on a few other things, so I'm going to try to get to it. So I responded to him. I thought I was very respectful as I can be. And I said, with all due respect, I don't really know what else you're working on, but I kind of think the cover-up of a chemical petri dish should be the top of your list. He never reported it. I just don't understand. It's like they're literally disregarding. They're just essentially allowing these people to be sacrificed. For what?
Well, we should challenge them. Everyone that you mentioned, you heard what we said today. I have test results that were recent. Like in the last couple weeks of my house, I have vinyl chloride in my house, and George Thompson said it was higher than the limit that should be allowed inside and outside of my house. Chrissy and Candy also have it in their houses. We need you guys to send someone here and test it because we know it's there. It shouldn't be in my house right now, but it is.
And the last thing I'll say before we wrap, listen, if you're watching, I know it's hard psychologically to get this, but just because you don't live here, don't think this doesn't affect you, because they didn't think it would affect them on February 2nd. Let me tell you something, and why I have worked on Flint for 8 years, and my book just came out on Tuesday. Don't think this can't happen to you, whether it be water or a railroad or a plastics factory or a fracking or mining or whatever the hell fuckery they're doing. Do not think that this kind of thing cannot happen near you, or do not think it's not already happening and you just don't know about it. It's not always a railroad exploding. Sometimes it's a smaller, like a leak or a spill that you don't even know about. But if these people are just left to fend for themselves and you don't call your local Congress people and senators and governors and keep calling, if people don't protest on behalf of other people, we're all interconnected. And if they get away with this here, they've already pretty much got away with it in Flint, even though I've tried to keep that in this. They've gotten away with poisoning that community and declaring the crisis over. The water's still shit in Flint 10 years later. So why do you think they're literally using the same playbook that they used in Flint here? Bullshit testing, gaslighting the residents, everything's fine. Don't worry about your brown water in Flint. It's just aesthetics. It's not health. Bullshit testing. The government says everything's fine. The media reprints those headlines, and then it's just normalized. So you got to get involved. Even if you don't live here, try to connect with residents. Call your politicians. Say, I'm not voting for you, and I'll get other people not to vote for you. If you don't, it's not enough. The railroad safety bill is nice, but that's to prevent another East Palestine. That's to prevent another Darlington. But what about them? Of course, we could do both. You want to have better regulation so this doesn't happen. But by the way, this did not happen merely because of deregulation. The derailment itself is not why everyone's sick. It's because they fucking detonated and nuked 3 days later. The chemicals from the fire were not good, obviously. It could have caused sickness. But they took the fire that was unleashing the chemicals and then they blew it up. That's what caused it. And that's worse than deregulation. That's letting corporations, letting I forgot the phrase. Fox in the henhouse, yes. So you got to get involved because it's not just about East Palestine. It's not just about Darlington or Unity or Beaver or whatever. It's about all of us. This can and will happen near you if you let them get away with it. Anybody want to say anything before I go?
People in the 20-mile radius should be pissed off that they didn't get the relocation that we got within the 1 mile, and now they're in this lawsuit. That should say something. They didn't have the safety. They didn't get told to be sheltering in place, turn off your heaters, do certain things to protect yourself when they knew the severity of it in the beginning. You people in that mile radius, you're getting less, but you should be pissed off. You should be very upset that they know they owe you something but never did anything.
And by the way, if you're watching, we got a decent crowd, but if you're from East Palestine and you watch this, if you're from Western Pennsylvania and you watch this, I know there's been a lot like beef between people, and some in the community say, shut up, let's move on. Some in the community are active. This always happens in these situations. There's divisions and all that. At the end of the day, you don't have to like your neighbor. You don't have to want to get a beer with your neighbor. You could think that people are camera whores, or you can think that people suck. But at the end of the day, whether you're sick now or sick in 10 years, you all need to come together here, because common sense, you don't blow up 1 million pounds of chemicals and it just vanishes, not affecting anyone. So if you're watching and you think it's time to move on, I would encourage you to listen to that toxicologist. I really would encourage you to listen to the expert with over 50 years of experience, because this could become one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
We'll be back. And if you're watching, obviously support us if you can. This kind of work is expensive, being on the ground. And join us as a member, $5 a month, statuscoup.com/join. We do not have any money from Norfolk Southern. We do not have any money from the usual corporate suspects. Our funding comes from you. I'm going to go change my shirt because I'm sweating like a fucking fox. The air conditioning wasn't really on here. Thank you.